Welcome back, everybody. Today we're going to make an initial connection to an API. Now, I don't know about you, but I take these tutorials and I get all the way to the end, my code is compiling, and then I try it on my own and I can't connect. So we are paring down to just the fundamentals to make sure that you can make that initial connection to an API. So stay tuned, and remember, keep your head in the cloud. Alright, so let's get started here. Get on the serious glasses. So the first thing we need to do is we need to create a project. The name isn't that important. This project will actually be online, so you can download it and follow along if you'd like. So then you select the API, and from here, what you want to do is load it on up. Wait for it to load here. And so we're going to create a few folders and kind of get ourselves organized. I usually create a models folder, a services folder, and an interface folder. So let's just get those in right now. All right. There's the models. We're just going to create one universal model for this call, and then services. And kind of the general layout here is the services is where we usually make the call. The model is what we use to pass things in and out. And the interface is, in this context, usually used for dependency injection. So when we set up our configurations right here, what happens is then we take those configurations and at runtime we inject them into the controller, and then it passes it down to the service. And then the service calls the API. So let's just add in URL, and we're going to be using simple Cloudware to make the call. They have a test endpoint that we can use, which is always good when you're making your first initial call to have a test endpoint, so you can check to make sure that you haven't made a mistake or something like that. I very rarely get the call on the first time, but I'm feeling lucky today, so we'll see. I usually get snagged on a spelling error or something like that. And here on this particular API, per their dev test stage, has a particular code to log in. So we'll be attaching that to the URL. So let's create our service. And let's just call this a process, since this is going to be just a test to make sure that the API actually works. It really doesn't have any other function than that. There'll probably be some other process-related things that we do in the future. Okay, so the first thing we want to set up is let's get our configurations in here. And remember, we had the two configurations, the base URI. And when you see this pattern for base URIs is really common because when you design things in a path to prod, the endpoints will stay the same name, but the particular dev test stage, these will change, and that way you can configure it to just have the base URI change in your environment, and then everything else will stay the same. So here we're creating our first function, and we're going to create this model here so we can actually bring it in. And if you also notice, we use the async task, and what this gives us the ability to do is call everything with the async await, so it's asynchronous. And this is really important, especially if you're starting to do things at volume. It's not mandatory, but it's a good practice. So here we're creating, it's just a really simple model. We're just going to capture the string response to make sure that we're actually making that connection to the API with this, and then we can pass this up and down our stack. And if you notice, I use the control period, and I use this over and over again, and what this does is it just adds the particular frameworks at the top. You can see I added the web application 3.models, and I do this by clicking the control period and then selecting it out of the model. And you could do this for all the different frameworks, so it's just a super fast way of going about adding particular frameworks to the classes. So here, this pattern, you'll see base URI, which changes per environment, and then the endpoint that we're going to call is test API. And here's another super helpful little trick, is to use the query helper, and this helps sort out the first parameter in a URL. You'll have to use the question mark instead of the ampersand. So if you just use the query helper, it sorts all of that out instead of checking to see if this is the first parameter or hand rolling a particular URL. So after this, you can just add, and it will add them appropriately to the URL. Next thing is we're going to set up a using. And what this is important for is when you make the call, you open the connection, and then if you put it in a using statement, when you're finished with that call, then it closes that down in memory. And this is another important thing to do, especially if you're making calls at volume, is you open up that thread and then close that thread when you're finished. And so if you're doing just little test projects, you won't notice, but at volume, you want to make sure that you don't have that overhead on the server. So we put the HTTP client inside of the using. And here we're using just the simple out-of-the-box request. And that has a request message and then the response message. And then you'll see we configured this just for a simple get and then throw in the URI. And another thing that we want to do, I don't think it's mandatory to call this endpoint, but if you don't add the appropriate headers, many times it'll trip you up because it's expecting either JSON or sometimes XML if you're dealing with an older system. So it's good just to call it out or know exactly what headers that you want to add. And now it's set up to start capturing our response. And here's our first await. And then we're just doing a simple send async, throw in the request, and then we'll capture that, get the content of that particular request, because it's going to come back with all the information in it. But we just want the content to see if we actually succeeded in the call. Oh, just when I thought I was going to type it all in perfectly. Oh no. So here's our content. And then we want to read all the way to the end. And then we're just going to read it into our model. Perfect. And then we're just going to respond with the particular content that's been automatically mapped into our model. All right, looks good. So let's take this and throw this into our interface and create that. So add the actual interface class, and don't forget to have this as public. I don't know why it doesn't start like that, but it doesn't come in. And then we use our classic control period to bring in the model. There it comes. Perfect. And now let's build out the actual controller to call the interface and then make the actual call to the process. So first of all, we want to bring in our configurations, because remember, we're going to pass those configurations in using dependency injection when we create the service. So we've got to get this created up front. And just bring that class in, or that reference. And then we're just going to use the dependency injection to put it on the constructor. It's a very common pattern. Just gonna copy this. And then we're just going to map what's injected to the private read-only. So then when we create the processing service, we can stick it right in there. And remember, when we first created the processing service, that we added the configurations. Now just copy that endpoint. And one important thing to remember is to add the routes. That gives you the ability to, especially when the project starts getting bigger, you want to have particular naming conventions, where it just starts off with the get and then it auto maps to it. But this gives you the ability to name everything. And then I usually name the function the same way. It's not mandatory though. And then we're just going to erase this action result because we're going to use the async await pattern. And then we'll just map it to that one model that we're using everywhere. Perfect. So now let's create the interface. Actually, let's give this a better name. I forgot when I created this, I needed to name it iProcess service, so it kind of matches what interface it's for. Oh, the details. Alright, let's get this in here. That's better. And now let's map this to our actual service. Autocorrect is giving us a little heartburn here. Alright. Let's get this in. It's throwing an error. Alright, looks like we need to add this to our function. There we go. We add the particular interface to this class. And then let's also set up the constructor on the particular process. That way we can inject it. Alright, and then let's map our two calls to our private strings. And I usually use the get value with a string because there's all different types of things that you can map in here. And so if it's an int or something, this gives you the ability to qualify what type of configuration that you have. And we'll just copy this. And let's bring in the code. Perfect. Okay, so now we can actually inject in the configurations. Now we're getting really close. So there's the configurations that are injected in. And then let's make the actual call. Our get test. And then we're just going to return the response. Perfect. And then it looks like we need to make this await. Alright, so all the code is in. So what is the likelihood that this fires on the first time? Knowing my history, it's about 0%. So let's see what it says. All right. I should put a drum roll in. So let's see what happens. Oh wait, let's put a breakpoint in here so we can actually see us tracing through the code. Alright. Drum roll, please. Alright, looks like our injection is working. Okay. Let's make the call and see what the server says. Okay, URL looks alright. And it dies, of course. But don't you fear, we're gonna figure this out. So let's run this again and see if we can take a closer look at that URL, because it's obviously not hitting the endpoint at all. So that would be my first line of troubleshooting, is going, okay, am I actually hitting the endpoint? So let's go and take a look at this URL. Okay, so nothing looks bad there. Code looks alright. So let's go and take a closer look at this bad boy. Alright, and there's the problem. There's no slash there, so it's obvious, just a typo on my part. All the details. So let's go and throw a slash in there and see if we can actually make it to the API. So you can see how that first error was showing that it just wasn't even close to getting there. There's nothing that was coming back. So let's try it now. All right. Don't be overconfident. All right, at least we got slash in there. Let's see. Not found. Okay, but this is a better error because it's a 404, which means that we actually hit the box, but it did not find the endpoint call, which means there's got to be something we're missing in that URL. And this is exactly how it goes when you start trying to connect to an API. Is first off, you're not even close, and then you refine in and you get yourself to a 404, and you go, okay, here's the issue. I needed to have API as part of this. So once again, it's just an attention to detail issue. But once you're at 404, you know you're close. Now you look to see if you have some sort of a misunderstanding on the endpoint, or maybe you're not logged in or something. But let's try it now. I'm feeling fairly confident. Are you? Alright, here we go. Boom! My favorite thing, the OK. So that's it. So not only did we connect to an API, but we used a model, we did interfaces, and we did a little bit of troubleshooting looking at just straight errors versus 404s versus the ability to then actually make a connection with it. Okay, so with that, I think we have successfully logged into an API. Thank you for watching. If you have any comments or suggestions or things that I could do better, put it in the comments below. I also want to hear about any ideas for future videos. And right now we're going to break the current record of 0 likes. Push that button now. Keep your head in the clouds.